Dashidele to all the Sangha joining us on the live stream from all over the world. Good morning.
We'll begin with opening prayers in the Yellow Prayer Book on page 1.
Dola damar sebe dranu par sebe tarva dan tam jen jimbe bardu jubar se tam je zor sebe manam ka dan yambe semjin dewa dan den donga dan ra yurdu la name Yanda badu be sanjo rambo toba.
All mother sentient beings, limitless as space, especially those enemies who hate me, obstructors who harm me, and those who create obstacles on my path to liberation and omniscience, may they experience happiness, be free from suffering, and swiftly may they attain precious, unsurpassed, perfectly complete enlightenment. All mother sentient beings, limitless as space, especially those enemies who hate me, obstructors who harm me, and those who create obstacles on my path to liberation and omniscience. May they experience happiness, be free from suffering, and swiftly may they attain precious, unsurpassed, perfectly complete enlightenment. For that purpose, until I attain Buddhahood, I will apply my body, speech, and mind to virtue. Until death, I will apply my body, speech, and mind to virtue. From today until this time tomorrow, I will apply my body, speech, and mind to virtue. Mandala offering on page 7.
Ma lu lo ye lang de ber la na de nian zhe gong tu jie zong de so da le long ju do ba jin jie da peng kam jin jian char yong de ma jie da de zong wen gu bo chur se gun ber jie dang zin xie war sen jie lo nge dan nge mian ta le yong zhe xin jian ge ne song zhou wong ta jie jie men qian len de ne lo mian zhen jiu per we san jie to ba xin jie lu.
An infinite array of worlds, each with 4 continents and the wealth of infinite oceans of realms. If I bring them all to mind and offer them without exception, please hold with compassion all the beings they contain. My body, enjoyments, and whatever I own, my aggregates, elements, and sense sources, my aspirations now and in times to come, as well as everything I grasp as mine. By offering them all, may I be blessed with the end of self-grasping, completely liberated from the bounds of real and unreal, transcending the names and concepts of arising, cessation, and abiding, coming and going, affirmation and denial. The supreme mandala is the natural state. By offering it, may I be blessed to attain the state of Buddhahood.
Om Guru Deva Jagana Renda Jala Padit Sova
Page 10.
Nam Je Sambada Lo Ye Zera Jedava Ye Jong Tu Mon De Bo Ye Chu Jian Ko Lo Gu Du Zu.
Please turn the wheel of the Dharma of the greater and lesser vehicles and the teachings common to both according to the dispositions and mental capacities of sentient beings.
다다다 자 우리들이 낙도지고 나는 또 봤으면 지시는 이런 것들 저 달았더니 자동지 되지도 봐지 이 달때 zambu지 뭐시나 가람세 들때서 이들은 들 마다만한테 들때 속다처럼 소화 도용 저걸 때 초고 다 대리 차당 철실 들때 소화 레바지 초아레바들 초바이면 마시래 어때도 예다 인지 봐 말은 되고요 나한테 도망가게 잡다실 나라 인지 문제 저라저라 나 이동하지 고요 돼서 일치고 차더래 들이 이도 마음을 다 나만 인지 가래 들이 대라디 제만아리 배송에 송철 지선장이 차당을 가서 추가 나오는 독성 지송철지 지선장이 들이 레사 당신을 받자죠. 이 말하더니 말골래서 들이서 말하더니 좋은 다 사들 이 차당들하고 성성전에 별로 몇킬로 당보지도 뭐 어떤 게 들이 책임 받으려 들이 바로바로가 자 들이 양양 된지서 들이 잘자 들이 자니 차당제 들이 저거들이 들이 거기에 삼별자 계속 쏘게 요래 다 때라서 봐 다서 치고는 약합 봤다 차당 치고 쏘고 요래 잡을게 약합의 차당이 하자 똑같이 뭐또 약합들 몇번 가서 뒤 포르들이 차당들이 좋고요래 뒤 촉치고 뒤 쪽바르고 자 뒤 대단 잡을래 딱 저거 안 먹어요 다들 능력 탐색 되게 정도요래 되게 레사 약과 되게 다 레디나 밤이만 다다다 나타다 동년자 따와 탐색 레게 될 따따인 거요래 또 레를 송거요래 그래서 차당 철수는 좀 가리죠 다 철수를 레사한 것도 없어. 레사를 가려야 돼. 다 레제 민인 것도 없어. 대하고도 초반이들이 막이라든 말이야. 초하고 차당 출발들 또 인지면 다 하고서는 들이나 봐 차탐지 라지 것들이 쳐달랍지들 별이 몽동아 라지랑 사라사 돌을 별을 쳐라로 먹지 해서 다다들이 송거를 하고서 선들이 참 너또 막차 같은 게야. 저를 뭐지 되더니 니서 면한테 획득고요. 장소로 다지 이거는 말이 그 장소 발라는 거예요. 발락 쳐다 탐들 하기 획득고요. 배제다 그랬더니 샘도 장소 따오고 나파 따오고 무슨 나파 또 됐다서 단데 한장 땡서 보더니 공부하시 그런데 다지 인항상에 자기들 차장 쳐봤지 봐서 너는 천적가리 넣고도 맞추는 까지 배려도 능이 먹고는 다 능이 주고 출발해 좀 해. 그렇다 보면 뭐지 타바고 주고 언제나 또 주전처럼 들리고 또 그랬더니 다다 소말에 배는 대할 때는 추천 천디나 천도르디나 다다 다다 이제 다지 인왕의 성을 했지. 들기들은 보면 말이지. 들이다 나타다 능이 차라 탐시 들이 유머가 노아를 돌아서 봐. 샘밀성, 샘밀 박사르성, 들이대려 사기야 샘밀성, 호화 샘밀성, 혼재지가 여직 대사들이 샘물대로 광주만 해봐서 대샤롱만 따때는 인진이 쇼는 되는 서로나 철로 졌다와지 까도 이런 타발 모두고 니 대답할 때 사와지 내리고 또 그래. 그렇게다 기방을 보나 그랬지. 너무도 저들은 생을 좀 가래. 다 잡아고 주고 니 사마도 양고리를 놓고 그런 말이지. 철을 좀 가래요. 막 철을 좀 가래요. 철만 천지 제발 가래야지. 철이들이 들고 나왔는데 니니속 내 말들이 띠띠 양들이 그럴 때 당분이 들이 시기 나와야 mention the big change. There could but now imitation big the Medina with just on it. Now imitation big and home now on the basho. The battery she it to the young less armory. The battery in the battery torture till she did it. I don't know. The battery in Barasong they tell the show and she married to Barson. That's a long tour for you. One jackson, pick up her door. 랑진이 철라도 이 조철이 파티칼이 따라를 세나 뭐가 냠냠도 되마도 나도 또 새로운 감이 라고 초하게 되는 진성 배는 나도 샤서 되리스 지지네 문이시 초차가 연구 내지지 연구를 차왔다고 되지 뭐 말해 샤서 지들은 랑진이 되지 어떻게 해서 왜 매기는 내면 문이래서 이 양당한테 살아서 미리 상고 당은 그래서 미 맞아야지 그래 무슨 샤미고 도 로서는 미리 내가 하고 가잖아 속 샤미고 로처럼 마치는 근데 미리 깨끗이 해요 이제 또 미리 사비로지 이래요 말이에요 다 그냥 시고 다 시고 그래 다음에 미리야 사고 말이야 사고 말 대다고 차고 남이 제일 맞지만 남이 아직 언제 미리 그걸 납송들로 많이 사서 리리 문제들이 갑자기 야송하는 소화기 그래 뒤에만 싸우면 양당양도 되지 딱 공부하지 공부한 양당 들어가서 나한테 또 나고 대말 제가 좀 보여요 다지 이런 게좀 가래 고가 없어 좀 와서 항상 저것도 거기서 좀 뭐하는 저도 로야 이런 책이나 내용 거요래 말 많이 쓴 거래.
So today, then, my friends, we continue with the 7 branches of the secret mantra. And so we have already completed talking about prostration and making offerings. And today we come to the confession of negativities. And actually, because this is related to the 2 truths, there are many people who develop some doubts regarding this. And so that is because there seems to be a contradiction between the 2 truths. Because on the one hand, we say on the relative level, karma is infallible, and on the ultimate level, it is all emptiness. So many people have some doubts about that, and we can't blame them for having some doubts about that, because there will be these kind of doubts until one has really seen the true nature of one's mind or the view. And until one has seen it directly, there will be a perception, a dualistic perception of self and other. And so then from that perspective, there is karma that is unfailing. But also even that ultimately is empty of self-nature. There are many stories also from the time of when the Buddha was alive of people who encountered a lot of difficulties on their path when it came to this discrepancy between the relative and the ultimate. So it's that for this reason, it's very important to really contemplate that. And so that is then what the next verse introduces us to. And in my text, here on page 10, so this is the verse that begins the actual teaching on the ultimate truth. And so it says, all phenomena are primarily and completely pure mind as it is. Within that, whatever confusion, dualistic appearance of oneself and others, distinction of good and bad, hatred and attachment there might be, each and everything, I confess, may it be purified within that state. So this shows the nature of all phenomena, or as it is said in the 37 Bodhisattva practices, appearances are one's own mind. So here you should remember these words, this verse in the 37 practices at once, because this relates also to the ultimate truth. And it really is, this verse in the 37 practices is really the essence of the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha. Everything is included within it. So this is verse number 22, by the way. And so actually everything is included in the 37 practices, all of the teachings. And so this is also the one teaching that I myself know and that I'm passing on to you. And that is also really all I know how to explain. So in verse number 22, it says, appearances are your own mind. Meaning that, so first you have to understand that the mind is, appearances are the mind, and then that mind is empty. In this way, in this order, kind of you realize the ultimate truth, which is non-duality. So ultimately, also karma is non-dual. Chikden Somgen had said in the Gongchik, on the level of Buddhahood, there is no division of the twofold truth. So there's no duality. Ultimately, no duality exists. So the Buddha already said that, and then Chikden Somgen said that this is how they describe the ultimate truth. So here, the confusion, whatever confusion or dualistic appearance of oneself and others and so on. So confusion begins with this appearance of oneself and others. So first there's this perception of self and other, and then due to that then appear the labels, the distinctions of good and bad and hatred and attachment and so on. So on the more coarse level, there is the coarse distinction of samsara and nirvana. And then on a personal level, it's more subtle. So then we have a distinction, we have a division between self and other, and feelings of happiness and suffering. And on a very subtle kind of division is that between hope and fear, which also are thoughts of attachment and aversion. So first, the mind is like water, like completely pure water. And then a particle, a very small particle, pollutes that pure water. And that is ignorance. So that's the first kind of polluting particle. And then the second polluting subtle particle is the attachment to the self. And then the third is the aversion against other. And so due to these three, ignorance, attachment, and aversion, samsara arises. And so this is how the confusion of samsara arises. So whatever this confusion arises from this dualistic perception. And then due to that, we create karmic imprints, habitual patterns. And these karmic imprints in the mind cause us to accumulate karma, driven by attachment and aversion. So because this is sort of the underlying basis, even if we do good things, even if there's a good quality, if that is connected to a mind of attachment or aversion, it will still turn into a fault. Or even if it is virtues, it may just be virtues, like half virtues and half non-virtues, because we are controlled by dualistic grasping and confusion. So in brief, what this is saying is we must cut through the perception of a true or substantial or concrete reality. The Buddha also said in the Diamond or the Vajrakata Sutra, you have to cut through grasping at outer characteristics. And what is that? This grasping at true characteristics, or these concept structures in the mind, is this feeling that arises in the mind where you think, oh, this is what it is, that's how it is. So this thinking, this is what places an imprint in the mind. And then we are controlled by these imprints. So first a feeling arises, and then due to this feeling, an imprint is created. And so then naturally, these imprints reinforce and they proliferate within the mind, and constantly this thought of an I and me arises. So it begins a very subtle. Sometimes also there's a very subtle thought that arises. For example, when somebody says something nice to you, praises you, and just a little bit says something slightly nice to you, and immediately there is this feeling of liking towards that. Immediately you feel attached. And you think about it. And so that is basically, we call that the thoughts that grasp at or kind of conflate the inner concept and the outer object. And if we interpret whatever we hear in a certain way, basically. And that is a fixating thought. And so then when somebody says something nice, immediately we listen and we are very happy about it. But then the moment somebody says something slightly unpleasant, or the moment we encounter any of the 6 sense objects, form, sound, smell, and so on, that is slightly unpleasant, then we reject that, we dislike it. So when we like something, you think that I want that feeling. I want to encounter this object, any object of the 6 senses. And then, first you identify it and you think that this is it, this is this feeling that you want. And so when you have some mindfulness, then the moment this feeling arises, you recognize this is attachment, this is clinging. Now I'm being deluded. But for the most part, the problem is not the feeling, but the problem is that people don't recognize that feeling. They don't recognize that they are actually deluded, and they just justify the feeling arising. They feel that, of course, this is how it is. Of course, I need to feel that way. Of course, I need this. So the feeling is backed up by the self, the me. Of course, the me, I need this. I need any form, sound, smell, touch, and so on. Any of the 6 sense objects. And I need anything that is pleasant, anything I want, and I do not want anything that is unpleasant. So Milarepa also said that a practitioner who follows is carried away by the ordinary grasping to attachment and aversion to the outer objects is always miserable. Because we follow our karmic imprints. So there's this feeling that arises. Again, the feeling places a karmic imprint in the mind. It forms a karmic imprint. And then that imprint is like a habitual pattern that causes us to act out, like we say something. And in this way, we accumulate karma. And on the course level, these feelings arise as attachment and aversion. But also they arise on a very subtle level. So first, for example, imagine there is a person who says something unpleasant to you, who insults you. So first, it's a very subtle thought. First of all, you think that it's a real person, and then the person says something that displeases you, and you don't like that. So then there's this subtle grasping of dislike in your mind. And then you keep thinking about it, so you're holding on to that grasping thought, and eventually that person will appear like an enemy. You start to hate that person. And this is really how in samsara we create this division between enemy and friends. And then even we go and kill others, for example. And this happens between countries too in the world. And that's actually the worst kind of attachment and aversion if it happens on a large scale between countries in the world. For example, there's wars and there are terrorist attacks and so on. And actually when a country is doing things like that, it affects the entire population negatively. And that's why it's so detrimental when countries on a larger scale engage in such activities. And actually, all the suffering of the people in a country really comes from the negative actions of the country on a larger scale. So in any case, all of this comes from karma. And nowadays, for example, all the suffering and the illness, the disease that we experience in the world, it all really comes from such karma. So mainly it is said that all arises from karma. And so here we should reflect, what is the fault? Why is it not good that we are controlled by attachment and aversion? What's the fault of delusion or confusion? The fault is that if the mind is deluded, we will accumulate karma. And what happens when we accumulate karma? Karma will ripen. So that is something we need to understand. So in the tantric 7 branches, so this is how we need to understand it from the perspective of the view, how grasping arises, these thoughts of attachment and aversion. So mainly it all begins, first of all, with a dualistic perception of self and other. So there's this imprint, this habitual seeing things in a dualistic way. And then from this, just naturally, all thoughts, our fixating thoughts arise. As somebody who has understood the view or the nature of the mind will see all of these thoughts arising just like waves arising on water. The 5 poisons arise, but they are self-liberated upon arising. Just like drawing like an image on water. As you draw it, it already disappears. So it disappears on its own when you recognize the view. So first, there's a thought, a subtle thought that arises. And when you recognize that thought, you see that the thought is inseparable from the mind, just like the wave is inseparable from the ocean water. And that recognition will naturally cause that thought to dissipate, like a wave dissipating. So that is how we should understand the grasping in our mind. So actually, when you read this verse here, you really have to think about it deeply. It has a very profound thing to understand, a point to understand here. This line, this confusion and dualistic appearance of oneself and others, and distinctions of good and bad, and so on. So in brief, what you need to reflect upon here is what are the shortcomings, the faults of grasping, and what is the benefit of not grasping. If you do not want to suffer, basically, then you should not grasp. And grasping leads to confusion or delusion. Gampopa said in the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, he explained how confusion comes about, like the stages of how we become confused like that. So he begins his teachings with that actually. And then also tells us the manner in which we become liberated from them. So how we become confused, it begins with the dualistic perception of self and other. So that is what you need to keep in mind. And this is where all the suffering, all the sickness arises from. The suffering of the 6 realms of samsara arise from the afflictive emotions which arise from the dualistic perception of self and other. So this is really the essence to be understood. Even if you were to read the entire scripture, the entire book, this is really what it is about. It is about this fundamental grasping at a mind that is actually non-dual. As it is said, samsara and nirvana have a single basis. The actual nature of the mind is stainless. And the Jewel Ornament of Liberation explains how from this stainless state we come to such a confused state. So first what arises is a dualistic perception, and then from that arises the confused, distorted perception of self and other. So that is the most important point, even if you don't read the entire book. So we need to understand in brief what is the benefit of not being confused or grasp, and what is the fault of confusion. When you are confused, then you grasp at a true concrete reality of appearances, the true existence of what appears. So it begins with grasping, and grasping leads to clinging. There's this quote by Tilopa that says, "Son, it's not the appearances that tie you down, it is your grasping at them." Actually, some people say, "Son, it is not the appearances that tie you down, but it's the clinging to them." But actually, there's a slight difference between grasping and clinging, and it really actually first begins with grasping and not clinging. So first there is an appearance, and you grasp at it, and that grasping leads to clinging. And then this clinging leads to accumulating karma over and over again. And therefore, we need to recognize the grasping first. It really depends on whether or not we can liberate the grasping thought. So grasping thoughts will arise, but the point is to liberate those grasping thoughts so that they do not develop into clinging thoughts. So it all arises from karma that arises from clinging, that arises from grasping. That's why the Buddha said in the Vajrakata Sutra, you have to cut through the coarse concept structures of appearances. And what that also means, as you mentioned before, is you have to experience it. We have said that your practice must be imbued with actual experience, meaning that if you know how to meditate, then whatever thought or clinging arises in the mind, you will just let it, or grasping arises in the mind, you will just let it be naturally and allow it to dissolve on its own, just like a wave subsiding back into the ocean. So if you know how to meditate, then you will self-liberate these grasping thoughts. So that is the practice that is imbued with experience. So again, first a thought arises about anything. So a thought appears and you recognize, I'm grasping, grasping arises. So the thought is, that's the grasping arises in the mind. And then if you don't recognize it, then the thought appears and then you begin to think about it further and you think, oh, this is how it is. Oh, this is really how it is. You believe in whatever you're thinking. It begins with this very subtle grasping, this belief in the truth of whatever you are thinking. So actually, also what this is to say is that the mere appearance of a thought does not mean that you believe in its reality, that you believe in the truth of this thought. You can have a thought, but then you recognize it. But if you don't, and if you begin to believe, yes, this is true, whatever you're thinking is true, this is how it is, then this is what leads to confusion. For example, and you see another person, and first of all, you think the other person is real. And then you keep thinking this again, and so this person becomes this solid thing, the person. Actually, even that does not inherently exist. For example, those who are reading the Heart Sutra will understand that. It explains, the Heart Sutra explains how things do not inherently exist, even though they do appear. So you can see a person, you can interact with them, talk to them, but there is no thought of that's a real person. But there also is no thought of that's not a real person. So you neither think real nor unreal. And so that is the difference between someone who practices and someone who doesn't practice. Someone who doesn't practice will first of all think that that's a real person and he said this to me. And so you believe in it. It's like kind of being a fish being hooked to something, so you become hooked to that. And so in this way, through recognition, you gain experience. So meditation or practice means an actual experience. And so the experience is to recognize the dualistic appearance of self and other, the grasping arising within the mind. Or as it is also explained in the Samantabhadra prayer very profoundly, there's a single ground but two paths into fruitions, and it all arises from unawareness, not recognizing this single ground.
그래서 차당 출발기 받지 봐서 네가 미지리 다랑기 소속들이 득밤을 겨울에 코와 토마미 바로 다 받았어 봐. 득접성 이걸 상모도 그 샷바지 시작한디 애들이 수그대도 mamma 집에 다들 일어서 다다 능이를 띠니 득밤을 겨울에 하고 먹기와스 동의들이 동의들 띠니 동의미나 이 강기와니 강기와니 하모 대니하고 최대들이 저 기와에서 온데 대화지 좀 기와서 온데 동의지 대회들이 득바 샤고 동의지 대화 고에는 딱 기와고 그랬어. 그 대동령 나보다는 들이자는 도당을 대동령 가는 동안이 있어 도당을 다들 계속 이어 말이죠. 도당을 계속 나. 샤브지 이어 말이죠. 그좀 다지 이어는 정도 들이텔라 다 차당이가 마들이 레서와 강요면 그때 촉치와 들이니 들이다다 먹겠죠. 참이가 되어서 봐서 선도들은 먹기와 껴서 이 동네에다 다 잡을리는 따뜻한데 세 통원이 자스 좀 넓어버리는 자스 동동 똑똑 내 마블린 자서 죽거든 내 자철들은 일단 잡을리는 동네들은 됐는데 제 강에 하든도 차시 나도 무슨 일이 스타일에서 니몽도 좀데 동아차 동아들 노차다 신난데 몽쪽 그래서 당서 더블링에서 파파냐면은 뭐 그래 조아를 저거 등에인데 탐지 짜서는 짜와도 상지 다시 하고 그래 왜 이렇게 대샤를 당이 지나가죠 지나가지 같이 라만단 말이죠 우리 당이 득박거리 기어리 마다 득박치 왔던 지로 맞아 참 득박치 위에 가로 또 당소 득박치 기 좋아서 유무관은 내가 내게 말하는 거 유무관들이 유무관은 유무가 말이 유무가 나지는 또 가래 네 니발이 막 맛이 맞았다고 먹으래 니발이 막 신이 우리 때렸으니까 베르스다 동의를 남았니 오래지 가시를 동의 가래 요나한테 득바라 용티 밑에 득바라 샤브에다 받고 용티 있어 대호콘이 레주비 때서 하고서 탐색이 따뜻한 답이나 레주비 케리마 용요리 저래 옛날 따뜻한 때서 유모가 득바 케리니 탐색이 오땅에 득바 세서 된 적마서 면 무슨 소리 오만 비비용 라고 요래 따뜻해 제 샤바세 세면 너는 샤바스면 누가 찍으래 누가 제시거래 얘는 누가 봤을 땐 적마서 가래 적마서 이는 동의지 봤지 라라 동의 미고 때 적마서 나 동의 연구를 때지 때고서 시작하래 얘도 제바 보지 유모가 싸웠다고 보자고 요래 얘를 뒤에서다 유모가 족지 저도 내서도 유모가 족래 유모가 족지 쳐드는 다 간다 다지이지는 말 받았듯 말을 받을 때 동담 빼라 그쪽 시작하다 동담 시작하다 그쪽 시작하니 강리 그쪽 시작하다 다 사바체미 봐 정이 이제 체미 봐가 다시 약해요래 되게 가르쳐요래 다리 마존의 유모를 싸워매 빼를 도장에 쏘도 말아서 답도 거절하는 거야 오늘 코도 뭐 샷아봐 가라면이 무슨 매들 뭐 이거 샷도로스는 매매 사거래 속차 사는 거래 탐매의 코트에다가 그런 원래 레사를 생각을 레사잖아 나도 알고 다 하면 맞아라 앉아 차대 무슨 몇 개도 로서 사거래 내가 레드 감성 다 생각해서 야 대는 이제 유모가 누가 탐지 유모가 철기 누가 탐지 유모가 덕거다 대 유모가 덕지 레지는 아주를 철리 아주를 감수 심지 덕접지 유모가 되니 라게 유모가 덕 직바 직장 제대로 가까이 올 말이지 감수 심지 다다 랑가 다지고 다시바 지와 차들 대때 유모가 차대 올라가 대라 뒤에 사사 조선 바탕지에서 랑게 유모바데 랑게 유모바는 거는 감수 심지 유모바레스 대라 득바 샤과 까니 따게 유모바더라는 거죠 오 감수 심지도 해줬대 벨셰당 따다다 제가 나서 소치 벨 단다버는 내 양도서가 있는 거요래 그 수고해야 돼 다시 당나지니 다 소치 벨레지 뒤지 제가 가도 제가 다 다른다고 제가 의견 제가 또 보시는 거를 야 제가 뒤니 다 감성 심지 누구 자기가 그랬지 네 따르는 때 물을 못 타는 물을 못지 니양 동서를 있는 물을 타고요 배에다 하던 공부 담당이가 배저 당성은 니가 그는 물을 못지 그랬지 제 강인들도 가니 성도 다 초락하는 도도 제 강을 다 준비해 마시게 중을해서 준비해 신이 다 잡아시니 그 가능성이 다내 준비해 신이 다른 대반성 시스템을 기가 가지고 듣나 잡아시를 내지 잠시 다다 능력을 보러 내고나 텔레 양문은 빈주 양문은 되니 잡디 름도 강제를 하는 페이스북에 쫓아가래 같이는 동의도 따는 여기요 말이야. 뒤에서가 치발 가래리 달래기 말이지. 저렇게 다시 꽉 씌고 거기서 샤고 용지 가래리. 가지고 자도 같이를 강탑 가래지는 들이 쪽쪽이요 말이야. 그러니까 레트 사절이 유모가긴 봐 맛이 레요바 맛이 저도 쭉쭉 고통 조금 사와는 차서는 들이 레트 지금 매트 병이 민고요래. 타도가 레드 미네 동해들가 가리 레드 동해들 타도 팽이요래. 강리 비거리 레트 장도요래. 얘나한테 샤바치는 가리세. 그러게 당진의 레즈바도 진피를 놓치려. ramjigetri jinpito da jishone tri 라그 레는 뭐 산속 섭지는 쓸때 같이 납체뭐 벨들이 따풍매 잡아는 다고 송로 까빠스베 대파야 기와야 됐어라 까빠스타고 기와야 코소적이 줘볼 수 있어도와 오 기와 탐지 기와 쇼지 삼세리 그 코소적을 하면서 까빠찍을 들으라면서 기와세 바탐지 책을 진짜 삼세리 책로도 대는 이제 산소sem 찍게는 대답을 들으면 코가 통만 매와라 이게 란진이가 좀 있다 여기 산소sem 찍게 란진이를 배고 이 대선지선 대답 배고래 대답을 들으니 샤바는 또 답이 샤바 따와 하거나 사자침이나 좀 까봐 똑똑하고 듣고야 루미 지금 뭐처럼 새송 또 답이 샤바 오 십지 사제 터지고 봐 책대 좀 뭐야 누가서 다 손을 선대식 주고 대더리 대에 다 거는 다 샤과 집안들 다다 누가 좀 가래는 동해 가래는 막 뉴모블 레레스 뉴모가 다다라는 줄은 덕스 뉴저가 도고치는 되는 덕스 대더라게 뉴모한테 즉 하고 성대 중으로 변 시장 집어들라나 시장 때 하고 무슨 소나 이 상속 습지는 라지 니게들이 되와 샤트고요 땐 동남도 시장면은 따위 시소 막 다들 그 거는 사과는 그래서 우리 무이 실려가 유무반데 빵와 저와 시바 섬 거네 다른 말이 거네 빵와도 소탈게 다 소고지 다도 그냥 지금 빵거 요래지 사실이 저와 오 습지 탐지 단인사가 파만 맞이 봐 상속세부터 답다 상속세부 상바다 니게 저도 요래지 상하게 시바세 오 유머 랑지메 하고는 다 하고 좀 다 돈다고들 밖에 저거를 사다지로 따로 나중에 엄마에 그냥 제가 소들이 돈다고 시작하지 대도 번저 시스템을 거는 되는 유머잖아 그 랑지 동문이 상속세비 감도 마시니 지금 나와 사제 받으나 오 랑게 유머 링이 유머 하고 뜨거워 하고 그래 대략적으로 사실 습지 되네 뭐 유머 찍게 습지 탐지게 유머가 따도 동동으로 하고는 대대로 랑주고 하고 나와 사제로 콩을 주고 탐지가 됐다고 될 사실 습지 거리 랑이가 비자고 제무요래 예를 때다 다들 내가 돌게 되어 그럴 돈은 다독대 사제 공항에 토 동대 다독 사제 공항 토야지 민성스는 사제를 좀 도움지 봐지 민성스는 지내야 민성스 시키는 대식 정보를 위다고요 말이야. 다톡 그래. 그게 사실 맞다. 나는 그것도 뭐 하나는 순간에 대식 정보를 위면 도움이나 다 좋까봐도 상만 보는 거잖아요. 저 남들이 대식 정보 어떻게 다 혼자 제대로 제대로 돌래. 들이 또 담대 막 통. 들이 다톡 사제 고마워. 로사요 말이야. 다톡 사제 제가 그래. 코와 돈을 조금씩 받아. 문인 코와 이거 말이지. 문인 코와 몇시 받아. 문인 코와라는 비바. 이보다 돼요 말. 그 대책이 뭐 밀지 돼요 말이. 냐르세 긴서고 신대책이 뭐는 남들이 자랑도 싫어. 그래서 살아나다는 리셉지 자체 뭐는. 예를 들지 차담 처발지 받든 집아데 또들 나딘이라는 데는 철성 내가 다음에 봐도 사바체미라서 봐거든요. 다음에 봐 산속세미. 내가 때리 돈다고 돼야 돈을 뒤다다다. 너는 따로 거니까 산속세미 거니까. 그것도 산속세미 사바체미 거니까. 돈당 산속세미들이 사자치고 거네. 이 샤바치야. 돈지 대리 차다도 맞지. 소소자서 하서 다졌지. 소소자서 somati 유머리 능이 하고 거래. 너 소소 능이 가래도 야 또 소자 동네 가려도 나서 동네에 실었더니 동네 시발사 또 들이 동네에 소화들 랩 소소로 동네에 되니 대샤부 탑요래 샤부 탑요래 가요래 다 세분의 lok도로 따와 상운도 세분을 요래 뉴모반들이 들들이랑이 뉴모반들 레라고도 토고요래 뉴모 중하고 성사나 라기 니까는 뉴모 제고 하고 대변 뉴모 도보에 코라자 이제 다들 매지 세자 다대변이 받치고 있어 제주고 너도 말이 되는 샤과는 됐다는데 땡사고 돼서 소소샤소라서 다저지 뉴모가 독대 하고 그래 뉴모가 독대 내 되게 좋아를 독차요 봐 이 등에지 하고는 진짜 또 뉴모가 독대 서로 가르치려 들으면 따는 거는 요 그래서 사바체미게 장 또 남들이 따는 거를 사가지고 따기 시작하셔야 되기지 뭐래 돼야지 라살다 시나 문행용 뭐요 뭐 뉴모가 시세져 가지고 상하게 시바되는 유명그라지 세상 매롱따위 시리즈. 세상 매롱따위 카피잖아. 가리 세상 매롱따위 가리래. 야, 주 세상 치보들 나무 까비 다졌다. 주 하장세로 도 치보. 로 망고는 냠지 내리나. 세상적으로 세요 뭐가. 지사지도 가천성. 다주 세如果 맞아 난 맺지. 난 just 세상에 대서 사바도 돌아다 까봐 동도 사고 득바 까봐 소도 동도 사고 기와 돌아다 까봐 동은 사지에 고마서 이제 사족서 사바세 사세레시 대 매발 담성 그때 지금 그런 때 너무 보여라 또 보고 또 못세 거는 또 보고 또 못세 거니 딱가리도 지금 하나 파마세 거니 누가 내라서 바탕지 그 대도 파마 삼세 건 제가 지는 대세 토함 대수지 또도 갈리 상대 상 돌아당 돌리 다들 대처하고서는 깨다도 그 동단데 있으면 왜지 메롱다 왜지 사도 싸고 차들이 이제 소를 내고 요래 오야 이제 소를 내고 이제 소를 내 값을 엄청 내 값을 들이 셔보아당 들이 좀 좋다 들이 따뜻하다 인속가 앞송 그래서 딱 유명한 세상 쳐본 거는 이제 서로 데려올래 요래 이제 이제 사기 나타 냠송 그래서 막 저래 너를 이제 서로랑 이걸 내병 그요래 들이 대회는 샤파 터몽 많이 바가래 솔직히 너도 유명 받대 무성 대 유명 받 적들 랑 유명 받 적들 야 무성 저기란 말이에요. 때는 랑 생위자들 랑 셈다 따따하고서는 랑 셈다 감사세기 셈지 저기는 니엄마 땅에 고로 저다 고차성을 따때 땅 내셔 가지고 참아는 팽기오래시 나지 다지 니엄마래시 너는 또 랑겠다다 야고는 랑게 초함에 봐 유모 인실 저성 때 랑 하고 고시 말하리 비송도 뭐만 명당 들어가서 니모가 이시래 이모가 이시래들 다처럼 검자 님 딸이라 말이야 다저 딱살해서 뭐래 나도 시간 심보라서 당하면 되고 가성도 하정 셈 싸워 렌도 니니야면도 대로 하고 어떤 민일이 잡선지 상지 민이 시당 면로도 시 니몽지 이시 민인들야 독사 다 이치 되니게 책도 동성을 대도 샤빠게 거래 야자 기침 거래 til때 고만 명당 들어가는 때 대답을 들 내가 따다마 저기 도랭지 과거 고만 명은 중에 도랭지 책들이 도랭지 til때 대체는 세카마다 하장 땡사버래 그런게 강시시 같이 대사 명령을 대탐제들이 쉬어 대체요래 하자다 내 하자 샷과 같이 뭐 샤록 가래리 뉴마시하고 그랬어 뉴마랑 샤도 다 도스럼 다이 뉴마 독다 미독 대념용 될라 그러면은 대답 하고 소소샤소라도 다지 야 마샤 가래 뉴몽이 시 뉴몽이 시 애들 조세당랑 선물 동거리야 뉴모랑 줄라 자르 드니스다 카르샤샤 되는 이제 내가 폐요래 더바서를 더바서를 동네에 지는 거 동네에 소문 유모 하고 하더니 자들 명령 같은 게 이몽이 실립적 톡을 했지.
So, whatever confusion, dualistic appearance of oneself and other, distinction of good and bad. So at that time when you read this, we are here in the branch of confession. So we bring to mind all of the negativities, all the confusion and so forth that we have developed in our mind. So we bring to mind all the negativity, all the non-virtues, activities that we have accumulated since beginningless time in samsara until now. And bringing them to mind, here we confess them. But here we also need to understand what it actually is that is to be confessed. So first of all, it is said, if you wish to know what you did in the past, look at your present body, your present life. So now if you experience a lot of suffering, recognize that this is the result of negative actions committed in the past, non-virtuous actions. And so it is actually through suffering that we are able to recognize that, this distinction between virtue and non-virtue. If we would not experience any suffering, we wouldn't be able to distinguish between what is virtues and what is non-virtues. But it is through suffering that we recognize, so the cause of happiness is virtue and the cause of suffering is non-virtue. So this is the meaning of confession, confessing negativities. Do you want to be happy? Yes, of course I want to be happy. So if you want to be happy, you have to confess the negativities from within your mind. Because happiness and suffering all arises from your mind. And so there is a relative confession and there's an ultimate confession. On the ultimate level, everything is emptiness. So ultimately, there's no distinction, no division between virtue and non-virtue even. And there is also no one to confess and nothing to be confessed. But on the relative level, when there is a dualistic perception of self and other, there are thoughts of attachment and aversion. And there is not a single karma that is committed which does not arise from these thoughts of attachment or aversion. It is just we develop them to different degrees. So there are the 10 non-virtuous actions, or there are the 5 extremely negative actions with immediate retribution. But in brief, basically all negative conduct comes down to the 10 non-virtues. And this is also why there is much suffering in the world. It all is like a karmic retribution, or like a karmic credit or a debt. So, for example, the experience of short life is the karmic retribution, or like the karmic creditor for having murdered or taken the lives of others, or the retribution of experiencing impoverishment. Impoverishment is the retribution of having stolen from others and having deceived others and having taken their wealth. Or the experience of illness and pain and so forth is the karmic retribution of having abused and injured others. So this is how it is actually explained in the Chöd practice. But so in brief, all of our suffering comes down to karma accumulated with attachment, aversion, or ignorance, really. Those are the 3 poisons. And the 3 poisons develop into the 5 poisons, and then we also speak about 6 poisons if we separate stinginess or greed and attachment. Now there's many people nowadays in the world who practice Vajrakilaya, for example, and that's also explained really well in the confession of the Vajrakilaya practice. It explains really that what it is that is to be confessed is what is the root or the seed of confession. It is within our own mind. It's not these or the various activities that we have done, but it is what causes us to do them. and that is our afflictive emotions. So there's no need to think about, have I done this or that with the body, what have I done? No, often people ask the Lama like what kind of negativities they have committed and pure and impure things they have done and what needs to be confessed. So it's not about all the extent of one's various activities one has done, but one has to see who was the one who did it. We need to get at the root of what actually has caused us to engage in these activities. And that always comes back to the mind, our own afflictive emotions. That is what we mainly need to recognize. That is what we need to confess. So the main point is that when the afflictive emotions arise, the way they are confessed is by recognizing the afflictive emotions and recognizing fault as fault. And not recognizing a fault as a fault is what we call ignorance. When you recognize a fault as a fault, then you can let go of any kind of suffering. So there's basically two kinds of suffering in the world. There are some people who suffer, but even though they suffer, there is some kind of relief from their suffering. And then there's others for whom there is no relief. It is said that there is no good quality in negativity, but if negativity had a good quality, then it would be its potential to become completely purified through confession. So there are some who have committed negativity, but they do understand karma, and they trust in karma. So probably nowadays there is not so many in the world who really believe in karma, but nevertheless there is some who trust in karma and who recognize that all negativity comes down to their own afflictive emotions. For example, they've said something and they recognize that was not okay, that was wrong. Like for example, they have hurt or injured somebody, or somebody lost their life and so on, due to their fault. So then they would say this was a fault, this was not correct, and they would then recite maybe a mani mantra and confess. And so the point of confession is really regret, feeling remorse, knowing that this has hurt somebody and that was not good, that was not okay, so they regret. So when they cause injury or suffering to others, they know that, knowing karma, they would know that my injury, my harming them, my causing suffering to them will ripen back upon me. So they recognize that harming others is actually creating their own suffering. So to recognize this is what we call the confession on the relative level. So here on the relative level, one recognizes who is the one who creates suffering. We get to the root of it, and that is the afflictive emotions, and such a person recognizes that. And so such a person then also recognizes that all the suffering in the 6 realms really comes down to the 6 afflictive emotions. And then if one summarizes the 6 afflictions, they come down to the dualistic grasping to self and other, which is what we call ignorance. So there is a confession on the relative level and on the ultimate level. The confession on the relative level really comes down to immeasurable love and compassion. Confession means laying aside, and purifying by laying aside. And on the relative level, negativities are laid aside through immeasurable love. And so how does that happen? For example, first of all, you recognize the afflictive emotion that arises in the mind. So it doesn't mean that there is no affliction ever arising within the mind. But for example, there's a mosquito that is about to bite you. So if you confess negativity with immeasurable love, then on compassion, you would think that this is also a living being, that living being is hungry and it's starving and it finds no food to eat. It's just like a human being. There are human beings, when they starve, they even eat other human beings, or animals eat other animals because they are starving, they are hungry. So you apply that to yourself. What kind of affliction is that leads to such an existence? It is the affliction of stinginess or greed, of the 6 afflictive emotions. And then where do you find it? You find it within your own mind. And it is because of that, this feeling of, this sense of starvation and impoverishment, that beings prey upon each other. And that's also why we as humans eat animals. So the reason why we do that is because of this sense of impoverishment. And from this, the various afflictive emotions then arise. And this is the root that needs to be tamed. So whenever you observe anything like that, like an animal and so forth, you should think about what afflictive emotion is related to this kind of existence. And then once you have identified the afflictive emotion, then apply it to your own mind. Take it onto your own mind. Think that I have this afflictive emotion in my own mind. And the afflictive emotions in my own mind and of all beings in the 3 realms is actually one and the same. So therefore, the negativities and the obscurations, the afflictions of all sentient beings in the 3 realms and my own 6 afflictive emotions are one and the same. They are not separate. So this is how we get to the root of this confusion, a dualistic appearance of self and other. That the self, this is this perception of me, the self of all beings in the 3 realms, and my own self are one and the same. So this is how a bodhisattva first recognizes. So they first recognize that when they observe suffering, the afflictive emotion present in their own minds. So first they recognize, and then they recognize that this affliction in my mind is the affliction of all sentient beings in the 3 realms, is one and the same. And it is the root of all negativity. Now, for example, anger, and all the other afflictive emotions too, but especially anger nowadays is really what causes disasters like the pandemic, for example, that we are experiencing. So who has created it? It is the karma that comes from having murdered or killed others with a mind of anger. And then where is that anger right now? We can find it in our own mind. And actually the way we treat the anger in our own mind is like almost like a friend. We justify our anger. So if you think about it correctly, you think that the root of all this suffering, of all beings in the 3 realms, is anger. And even though people have found a precious human body, they spoil it by getting angry and hateful and so on. Actually, if you think about it, it's extremely hard to find a precious human body. You understand that by reflecting on its causes and numbers and many illustrations. But it's extremely rare to find such a precious human body. And then even within that, even though it is so rare, there's so many, how many really spoil it, completely waste this human existence. And what is the fault of that? Why do they do that? It is because they do not understand karma. So what about a person who does understand karma? So a person who understands karma may engage in negative action, but they recognize the mistake in it, and they regret, and then with regret they confess. And through confession, even though they actually have done something wrong, but because they have confessed it in a previous life, then now in this life, even though some remnants of this karma is ripening, there will be some sort of rescue for them. For example, a medical treatment will work, or some ceremonies or pujas done for them will work. Basically, one can help them. There will be a condition that can help them and bring them relief. And so then there is some who have not confessed at all, and for them there is no relief. So the difference is the karma that they have accumulated, and the karma is the karma of confession. Those who have confessed in a previous life or regretted, they can, for example, be healed. There's help for them. And then there's others who, no matter how hard they try, nothing can help them. So that is because they have not confessed. And then, for example, nothing can be done. Then, for example, animals prey on each other and eat each other and so forth. So this is why this happens. because once karma is created, it must ripen. And it will ripen into suffering, but also ultimately we should understand that suffering is actually something beneficial. And why? It is because it purifies our negative karma. And we can purify it also through confession. And how we do that on the relative level, so we recognize that all negativity arises from self-grasping, and as a result we engage in action. Therefore, because it comes back to self-grasping, if you cultivate an altruistic mind, self-grasping naturally diminishes. And so this is this is how bodhisattvas practice. They cultivate bodhicitta, and it has the power to destroy negativity. It is said it is just like fire burning away a pile of dry grass. It just incinerates all negativity. It is said that the negativity accumulated in thousands of aeons is destroyed by bodhicitta. Or also conversely, the Buddha had said that the virtues accumulated in thousands of aeons are destroyed by a single moment of anger. So what is this virtue? The virtue is love. And when anger arises, it destroys aeons of love accumulated. So what is burned away or destroyed is love. It is bodhicitta. When bodhicitta arises for just a moment, it will bring a benefit to self and others simultaneously. So that is all on the relative level. Now on the ultimate level, we need to understand the view. That's the ultimate confession. In the Mahamudra teachings, for instance, it says that darkness of 1,000 aeons is dispelled by a single lamp flame. And that is the light of wisdom, of clear awareness. When you read that, you understand that sentient beings actually can attain enlightenment. That's really the meaning of these words, because they all possess Buddha nature. And once their negativities are purified, they are actually Buddhas. So this is how confession is seen from the ultimate level. So beings have accumulated negativities to varying degrees and therefore experience all kinds of suffering. And all of this suffering arises from afflictions. And where are they? They are right now here within my own mind, and I keep them like my friends. I keep justifying them like my friends. So first you need to therefore recognize your own affliction, the fault of your own affliction. For example, imagine you're getting very angry. When you get very angry, you instantly recognize the anger. So anger can arise, but if you, in this moment, recognize and, for example, as a bodhisattva would cultivate bodhicitta, through cultivating bodhicitta in this moment of anger, you can actually lay aside or kind of confess the negativity of self and others. And that is a very profound point you should really think about carefully. That is also what we refer to as anger is the mirror-like wisdom on the ultimate level, from the level perspective of the Vajrayana. So when we take the Vajrayana vows, we confess through transforming the afflictions into primordial wisdom. So basically, in the three levels of the path, there are three ways of confession. One is through abandonment, the other one is through transformation, and the third one is through recognition. In the Pratimoksha path, we confess through abandonment, so we abandon the afflictive emotions gradually. And then secondly, on the Bodhisattva path, they are transformed through love and compassion. And through love and compassion, you see all sentient beings as your parents, and there's no distinction between enemies and friends. So transformation happens through bodhicitta. And then third, ultimately, according to the Vajrayana, one recognizes, one knows the nature of the afflictions, and that afflictions do not actually possess any true existence. When one understands the nature of the mind, one knows the view, one sees that, one sees the ultimate truth, that there is no real affliction, there is no distinction between confession and someone to a confessor, there's no distinction between self and other. That's the ultimate confession. So, but there is those 3 ways of confessing or laying aside the afflictions. So through abandonment, transformation, and recognition. Since we are Buddhist practitioners, we have taken the refuge vow, starting from having taken the refuge vow and having become Buddhists, it is important for us to recognize our own afflictive emotions and to recognize that one's own afflictions and the afflictions of others are one and the same. Also, this is really the essence of cultivating bodhicitta, to recognize that my own afflictions are one and the same as the afflictions of others. And for this reason, because our minds are one, if I eliminate a single affliction in my own mind, then the burden of afflictions in all sentient beings in the 3 realms will become that much lighter. So this is how we practice the bodhisattva path on the ultimate level, how we, through bodhicitta, are able to confess and lay aside negativity of self and others simultaneously. And as a result, we create the causes for the happiness in the higher realms temporarily and ultimately enlightenment. So ultimately, all beings will attain enlightenment. Even if they wander in the 3 lower realms, it is said that the Buddha will never abandon them, meaning that their Buddha nature will never abandon them. They will always possess Buddha nature. That is why in the Samantabhadra prayer it says, from the beginning, we are all the same. We are with the ultimate primordial Buddha. And that is Buddha nature. This is the Buddha nature that will never abandon or forsake one. Even if aeons of wandering in samsara go by, one always possesses Buddha nature, and eventually, whenever the time comes that one cultivates compassion, one gradually then begins to create causes for birth in the higher realms, and ultimately one will attain enlightenment. There is no other place to go. Everyone will go toward ultimate enlightenment. There's no other place to go but enlightenment ultimately. And so that's also the meaning of when we say in the sadhanas to steer samsara from its depths, meaning that one recognizes that samsara does not really inherently exist. So there is no real ordinary kind of self-sufficiently existing samsara that possesses any kind of substances or stability. And that's because all beings possess Buddha nature. For example, even a hell being possesses Buddha nature, and one day the ice block of self-grasping will melt. And when they see the nature of the mind and cultivate an altruistic mind. So here in this verse, when we bring to mind confusion and the dualistic appearances of self and others, mainly we need to think that so all confusion comes down to the dualistic perception of self and other. And at the moment these kind of perceptions arise, you should recognize, now I have become confused or deluded. And on the relative level, you, as an antidote to that, in order to let go of this dualistic perception of self and other, you cultivate immeasurable love on bodhicitta, as a result of which you will actually see the ultimate truth. So in brief, on the relative level, we cultivate immeasurable love and bodhicitta, and through bodhicitta we confess. On the ultimate level, confession occurs through practicing, through meditating on Mahamudra. And so also when it says here, each and every one of them I confess, so each and every one also implies that you have to bring to mind each and every one of these afflictive emotions and recognize the suffering that they create. When you observe the suffering of other beings in the 6 realms, always relate them back to your own afflictive emotions in your own mind. For example, if you see the suffering of an animal and so on. So the Buddha said, in the beginning, you must recognize suffering. And that also means that recognizing the suffering of others means that a feeling arises in your mind. You feel the suffering comes to you. And then is there a way to confess or kind of lay aside and purify that suffering that has come to you? There is a way, and it is through ultimately realizing the nature of the mind, through recognizing that the seeds of all suffering are within the mind, the afflictive emotions, and our minds are one. So if you only know that, actually, it can become quite easy to tame, to let go of these afflictive emotions. So it becomes easy if you understand their fault, and that the fault is the dualistic perception of self and other. If you don't see this essential point, then you will keep the afflictive emotions like your friends and not really recognize their faults. So confession here in these words is really explained in a very, very profound way. So you must recognize the root of suffering within your own mind, the afflictive emotion. So that's most important, so that a real feeling arises within the mind. So that is not a division between the difference between the relative and the ultimate confession, which is really important. And so it says then, may it be purified within that state, within the natural state, may it naturally become purified, meaning that you recognize that the afflictive emotions do not inherently exist. And if you recognize that, then they transform into wisdom. And this is the confession of the Vajrayana through recognition or knowledge. So you recognize what the affliction really is, and this is what we call, for example, anger is the mirror-like wisdom. So we might know that, we might pay some lip service to that and say, oh, anger is mirror-like wisdom, but we also need to understand how that really is. How is anger really like mirror-like wisdom? So you need to really experience that yourself. Look at your own anger when you get really angry. What happens when you get really angry at someone? For example, someone that you actually love very much and someone you have spent many years together. One moment of anger is so destructive that sometimes people even want to kill each other. And like what has happened, that love has been destroyed through anger. And it's not the body that has changed, but it's the mind that has forsaken love. And so that is why many people spoil the love that they have, the bond of love. It is through just this moment of anger that arises. That's why we said aeons of accumulated virtue are destroyed by an instant, by one moment of anger. It is this anger, this hatred that cuts through our kind of rope to attaining enlightenment. Because what will lead us to enlightenment is love. And it is only love and nothing else. And so that is why really there is so much suffering now in the world, because people are losing their love. There is so much conflict between people, for example, between partners, male and female. Many people kill each other, or countries attack each other. Some people even kill their own parents and so on. So what really gives one the ability to do something like that, to kill someone that you love? It is because of anger. A moment of anger destroys all the love that you have had. So that is essential to understand the mirror-like wisdom. And recognizing the true nature of anger on the ultimate level, meaning that you recognize that you and the other are not separate, leads to seeing the mirror-like wisdom. When you look at the anger from a non-dual perspective, then the anger makes your mind be extremely clear. In fact, the mind is so clear that there is nothing else in the mind. So you actually, in this moment, you come to the natural state of the mind. There are actually 3 occasions when we naturally come to the nature of the mind. And that is when we die and the consciousness transfers. And secondly, it is during sexual intercourse. And third, it is during the deep sleep state. But actually also when a very powerful affliction like anger or hatred arises, we also come to the ground, the fundamental nature of the mind. And that is this ground that Samantha Bhadra had talked about. There's just this single ground wherein we are all equal. So recognizing that is really the ultimate or unique way of confession. So it is to recognize that your mind and the mind of all sentient beings in the three realms of samsara is one and the same. Our afflictions are one and the same. Therefore, if you abandon, if you overcome your own afflictions, you are naturally benefiting sentient beings, since the minds are one. There are no separate afflictions or separate sentient beings. The basis is one. So someone who knows the nature of the mind knows that. So someone who knows the mind will reflect first. So the mind of all sentient beings in the three realms, is it one, or are we separate from them? We are not separate from them. And if you just know that, then you know that through my confession, through my laying aside of negativity, I can actually benefit them all because I'm not separate from them. So mainly, therefore, to help others, you have to confess your own afflictive emotions and transform them into primordial wisdom. You have to recognize your own negativities, also in order to benefit others. And that's what Milarepa meant with practice or meditation has to be imbued with experience. And we all know that afflictive emotions are wisdom, and we can say that. We can say that over and over again. Afflictive emotions are really wisdom. And just giving some lip service to that is of not much benefit. You have to practice it. You have to habituate it. You have to come to a certainty. And through the certainty, really gain some confidence in knowing, is it really true? How are these afflictions really primordial wisdom? Or are they? For example, I got angry, and now I'm not angry. Now the anger is gone. But my mind is extremely clear, and there's no dualistic perception in the mind. The mind is really like a mirror. So this is how you really gain a personal experience of how the affliction of anger is the mirror-like wisdom. So you have to gain a real certainty through your own experience. And only then can you transform the afflictions. So when you gain the experience of transformation, and that is really when you can when the words really actually, the words of saying, if afflictions are wisdom, really actually bear any kind of meaning. So this is basically how we need to confess ultimately. So it is through personal experience. I'm not just saying or knowing something. So first you have to understand and know, of course, but you have to experience it through actual practice. And this is what these lines here in the Serkhangma prayer really show us. That's why this prayer is so profound. And so I'm just sharing these words as well as I can. So I don't maybe not know how to share so much. But this point about confession is really actually extremely important. Therefore, we need to emphasize it. So again, what really is confession? What needs to be confessed are the afflictive emotions. And for that, first you need to recognize them in your own mind. Are there afflictions? Which afflictions are in the mind? And then through recognition, let them go. So as Milarepa said, meditation has to be an actual experience. You have to actually do it. And then you can say afflictions are primordial wisdom. Then there is no ordinary afflictive emotion. Otherwise, if you don't really experience it and just leave it with some intellectual understanding, you can tell other people afflictions are wisdom, but then you still get angry at them and you still are harsh and unkind to others, and you still allow your afflictive emotions to go completely unrestrained. And then you may perform some verbal confession and recite some prayers of confession, but that in itself is really not of much use. There is some benefit of that, of course, because at least there is an aspiration, but the real seed is not being laid aside. You need to understand that the actual seed, what the source of confession, the source of or what needs to be laid aside is your own afflictive emotion, and not the words that you say. So that is what is meant with gaining some experience. So through experience, you have to actually transform the afflictive emotions into primordial wisdom. So now, Dharma friends, please take a break for 20 minutes. Namo, or homage to the Sangha.
Sangha,